Beneath chandeliers and frost-kissed windows, a woman steadies her breath. Catherine Elwood, elegant, beloved, expects a proposal that will set her future in stone. Yet in the mirror's hush waits another truth. A shy sister she adores, a duke she dares to love, and lessons whispered in kindness that may cost everything. Tonight, duty waltzes with desire, and a single choice could unmake a lifetime. Whispers carry a secret poised to break like glass, a past sorrow returning to test a steadfast heart. Are you ready to step inside? Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from and what draws you to period romances. The scandal, the tenderness, or the impossible rules. Bath, England, December of the year 1852. The morning frost clung like lace to the tall windows of the Elwood residence, painting the glass with delicate veins of ice that caught the weak winter sun. Inside the drawing room, a fire crackled in protest against the chill, its golden glow dancing across polished walnut furniture and velvet draperies, the color of mulled wine. The scent of rosewater lingered faintly in the air, remnants of Catherine Elwood's toilette, carefully applied for a day she had awaited with restrained yearning. She stood before the long pier mirror, motionless, as the maid adjusted the drape of her dark emerald gown. The silk shimmered subtly under the shifting light, catching against the black velvet ribbons that traced her sleeves and bodice. Her gloved hands rested gently before her, fingers entwined as if to hold something back, perhaps nerves, perhaps the weight of expectation. Her hair, a cascade of deep chestnut, had been braided and twisted into a chignon low at the nape of her neck, with a few soft strands left artfully loose to frame her high cheekbones. Catherine's eyes, grey-green like storm-lit waters, regarded her reflection not with vanity, but with the quiet intensity of a woman who knew that every detail, every fold, every gesture mattered. This was the final week of the season. And tonight, at the Christmas assembly, in the grand ballroom of the assembly rooms, she believed she would receive the offer that had long hovered in the air between her and the Duke of Carlton, Adrian Blackwood. His name alone sent a hush through the salons of Bath. Widowed, reserved, impeccably mannered, and yet beneath his silences and courteous distance, Catherine had sensed something unspoken, something delicate and profound. His eyes often lingered on her with a gravity that stole her breath. He would pause before speaking her name, as though it carried weight. In recent weeks, he had sought her company more deliberately, engaging in conversations that bordered on intimate, always laced with the ache of something unvoiced. She had not spoken of it aloud, not even to Margaret. Margaret Elwood, seated quietly near the hearth with a book forgotten in her lap, looked like a figure from a porcelain painting. Her fair hair was arranged in modest ringlets, her gown a pale lavender muslin that softened her already delicate appearance. She was 7 years Catherine's junior, sweet-tempered and painfully shy, a blossom that had never dared to open fully. Catherine. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "May I ask something of you?" Catherine turned from the mirror, her expression softening as she approached her sister. "Of course." Margaret hesitated, eyes fixed on the embroidered hem of her gown. "I know I am not like you. I do not sparkle at gatherings. I stumble when I speak, and I know my company is not sought after." Catherine knelt before her and gently lifted her chin. "None of that is true." Margaret's lips trembled with a small, sad smile. "It is, but I do not mind. What I do mind is how invisible I feel. I wish to be noticed, just once. I want to walk into a room and not feel like a ghost in the corner." A silence settled between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the muted ticking of the ormolu clock. Catherine, still holding Margaret's gaze, saw not just the request, but the plea, and beneath it, the hunger to be seen, to be chosen, to matter. "I will help you," she said at last with the firmness of a promise. "Whatever you wish to learn, I'll teach you." Margaret's eyes widened, glistening with gratitude. "Truly," Catherine nodded. "We have 3 days until the Christmas assembly. It will be your moment, Margaret. I'll see to it." The younger woman threw her arms around her sister, her embrace trembling with hope. Catherine held her close, unaware of the thread she had just pulled from the tapestry of her life. Later that afternoon, the sisters walked along the royal crescent, their cloaks drawn close against the bite of the wind. Catherine pointed out the gestures of poise, how to walk with shoulders relaxed, how to tilt one's head when listening, how to allow a smile to bloom slowly, like spring after frost. Margaret listened with the devotion of a novice at altar, mimicking her sister's movements, echoing her intonations. "Confidence," Catherine murmured, "is a language without words. Let it speak for you before you say a single thing." Margaret tried, stumbled, tried again. Catherine's praise was patient, warm, precise. In those moments, the elder sister felt the warmth of purpose. She had given so much of herself to her family, to society, to restraint. But giving to Margaret, this felt different. It felt right. That evening, as the lamplighters made their rounds and Bath began to glow under a canopy of golden gaslight, Catherine sat by her bedroom window. She watched the carriages pass below and clutched the small mourning brooch pinned to her collar, her late father's lock of hair encased in jet. She thought of Adrian's last words to her 2 nights ago at Lady Henley's musicale. "I find your company restorative, Miss Elwood. There is honesty in your silences." She had smiled then, but her heart had galloped. Now, with the ball approaching, the pieces were aligning. The gown, the moment, the man, and the sister she had vowed to help. She could not have known, she would never have believed that the very lessons she offered would become the instruments of her undoing. Not yet. For now, there was only the promise of the winter ball, and the fragile hope that love, once chosen, would never falter. The morning began with mist curling over the stone streets of Bath, veiling the world in a hushed grey that softened its edges. The air carried a delicate scent of coal smoke and damp earth, while the chimneys of elegant townhouses puffed white into the sky like gentlemen exhaling after a bitter truth. In the drawing room of the Elwood residence, the fire had been lit early, and the air within carried the warmth of promise. Catherine Elwood stood poised beside a tray of lemon tea and dried rose petals, her eyes set on her sister with quiet resolve. Margaret sat opposite her, hands nervously clasped on her lap, her expression filled with anxious anticipation. Her blonde curls had been brushed into soft order, but her posture betrayed the weight of her insecurity. The lavender ribbon at her throat fluttered each time she exhaled, as though it too questioned whether she belonged in the world her sister was about to unveil to her. "Begin again," Catherine said gently, folding her hands before her. "And this time remember, you are not apologizing for your existence. You are being invited into it." Margaret took a breath. "Good morning, sir. I trust you enjoyed Lady Henley's performance last evening?" Catherine tilted her head. "Better, but raise your chin. Look them in the eye. You are not a servant offering a tray. You are a lady inviting conversation." Margaret adjusted her posture, cheeks tinged with pink. "It is difficult to believe I might ever seem like you." Catherine crossed the room and crouched before her. "You do not need to be like me, but you must learn to occupy space, not shrink from it." Outside, the frost had begun to melt, glistening on the black iron gate, while carriages creaked past in rhythm with the season's anticipation. It was the second morning of their lessons, and already Catherine could see Margaret blooming. Not all at once, but in small ways. The stillness of her hands, the shift in her tone, the way her eyes no longer darted like a frightened deer's at every mention of the Duke. Catherine had arranged for them to attend a modest gathering at Lady Meredith's this afternoon. It was a safe, genteel affair, tea, readings of verse, and possibly a short pianoforte recital. But it would allow Margaret to practice the grace Catherine was instilling in her, not just in words, but in glances, in movement, in presence. After luncheon, the sisters ascended to their rooms to prepare. Margaret's gown had been selected days before, a soft cornflower blue with scalloped sleeves and a pearl button at the neck. It was modest but fresh, and Catherine had paired it with a white cashmere shawl embroidered with forget-me-nots. Her own gown was a rich plum silk that complemented her dark hair and deepened the color of her storm-grey eyes. As Catherine stepped into the drawing room with her gloves in hand, she found her mother at the window, watching the mist burn off the rooftops. "She's coming along," her mother said without turning. "She is," Catherine replied, smoothing a fold in her skirt. Her mother's voice held a tone she recognized, worry tempered with hope. "Do not invest too much of yourself in this, Catherine. You may awaken dreams in her that the world will not fulfill." Catherine met her gaze in the window's reflection. Better to awaken them than to let them die unbreathed. They arrived at Lady Meredith's residence just past 3, greeted by the scent of spiced cider and polished wood. The salon was modestly filled with familiar faces, ladies wrapped in shawls of moiré silk, gentlemen with cravats tied too tightly, and the rustle of paper fans fluttering like secret messages. The windows were wreathed in holly and red ribbon, and the light filtering through the lace curtains was soft and golden. Margaret clung to Catherine's arm for a moment before stepping forward. Catherine watched as her sister made her way to a small group of young ladies, her hands shaking only slightly. Catherine stayed near the pianoforte, nodding politely at acquaintances, yet her gaze remained subtly trained on Margaret, encouraging, protecting, hoping. "Miss Elwood." The voice slid into the room like a knife hidden in velvet. Catherine turned and found herself face to face with a man she did not know, tall, with dark hair brushed back from a high brow and eyes the color of deep chestnut, sharp and impossible to read. He bowed, his smile not unkind but too knowing. "Lord Nathaniel Fairfax," he said, straightening. "I have heard your name in most refined company, though not in the context I would have hoped." Catherine raised her brow with careful elegance. "Then I hope the company has the grace to improve." His laugh was low and unbothered. "I see the reports of your wit were not exaggerated." She inclined her head coolly. "And which reports might those be, my lord?" "Oh, whispers," he replied, stepping closer. "The ones that say Miss Catherine Elwood has eyes like a storm and the voice of restraint, but not the heart to match." Catherine's breath caught, but she did not blink. Nathaniel Fairfax tilted his head, studying her. "Forgive me. I do tend to disturb things I touch." "I am not a thing, my lord," she replied, "and I do not disturb easily." He bowed again, slower this time. "Then I am twice intrigued." He left her standing there, uncertain whether she had been complimented, insulted, or warned. She found herself unsettled not by his presence, but by the way he had spoken, as though he saw her, not through the mask she wore, but behind it. She turned her attention to Margaret, now deep in conversation with the young heir to a local baronetcy. Catherine felt a tug of pride and something else. A hollowness, perhaps, like the echo of an empty room one had once called home. Later that evening, back at the Elwood house, Catherine helped Margaret unpin her hair as they stood before the mirror. "You were wonderful today," Catherine said, her voice soft, threading a comb through the blonde curls. Margaret smiled at her reflection. "I felt different, seen." "You were," Catherine replied. Margaret hesitated. "There was a moment I thought the young Mr. Hargrove might ask to call." Catherine paused, then resumed the combing. "He may, but only if I do not say anything foolish next time," Margaret said with a nervous laugh. "You won't," Catherine assured her. "Just remember what we practiced. Speak with intention, but listen with curiosity, and never fill silence just to silence it." Margaret nodded, then turned to embrace her. "Thank you. I don't know what I would do without you." Catherine held her close, her heart full and aching. "You shall never have to find out." That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Catherine sat by the fire in her chamber, journal open on her lap. She dipped her pen in ink and hesitated, eyes tracing the flicker of the flame. She did not write about Margaret, nor about the Duke. She wrote only one sentence: "There is a man with shadows in his voice and mirrors in his eyes. Then she closed the journal and let the silence fill her. The grand ballroom of the Bath assembly rooms shimmered like a dream preserved in crystal. Dozens of chandeliers dripping with cut glass cast a golden glow over marble floors polished to a mirrored sheen. The scent of beeswax, winter roses, and orange pomanders floated in the air, mingling with the lilting strains of a string quartet tucked beneath the arched gallery. Candlelight flickered against gilded mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling, echoing 100 reflections of elegance, expectation, and fragile illusions. It was the night of the Christmas ball, the most anticipated event of the season. Carriages had begun arriving long before dusk, wheels crunching over frost-laced cobblestones, their occupants stepping down into a night chilled by December but warmed by anticipation. Inside, gowns rustled like whispers and jewels caught the light like secrets waiting to be told. Laughter fluttered among the balconies, yet every guest knew this evening could change the course of a life. Catherine Elwood stood at the top of the staircase, framed by carved mahogany and garlands of evergreen and scarlet ribbon. Her gown, a masterpiece of emerald silk and black velvet trim, clung to her figure with a quiet authority that needed no embellishment. A string of small pearls encircled her throat, and a single emerald teardrop pendant rested just above her collarbone. Her gloves matched the moss-green hue of her sash, and her hair, braided, twisted, pinned, glinted dark gold beneath the candlelight. The moment she descended, silence bloomed. Not full silence, but the kind that ripples beneath the surface of conversation. Eyes turning, breath pausing, admiration held politely behind fans and murmured greetings. But Catherine saw only one face. Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Carlton, stood near the central column, speaking to the mayor's wife with polite attention. His evening coat was black velvet, with a midnight blue waistcoat, his cravat fastened with the same emerald pin she had seen him wear twice before. His dark hair was meticulously groomed, his posture immaculate, but his eyes, those solemn, somber eyes, lifted the moment she entered. They met hers across the ballroom with the weight of memory and promise, and Catherine, without knowing why, could not breathe for one long heartbeat. He excused himself. He moved through the crowd, each step deliberate, his gaze unwavering. By the time he reached her, the warmth in her cheeks had nothing to do with the firelight. "Miss Elwood," he said, bowing, "you are surpassingly elegant this evening." "And you, Your Grace," she replied with quiet composure, "are as precise as ever." His lips tilted in what, for him, was nearly a smile. They spoke in low voices near the refreshment table, far from the waltzing couples. His words were chosen carefully, yet there was something softened in his tone, as though the winter air had thawed something inside him. Catherine asked about his niece's recovery from fever. He asked if her mother still favored the physician from Exeter. They danced around sentiment, yet their eyes betrayed a deeper conversation, one of closeness, of connection that did not need the crude confirmation of courtship rituals. At one point, Catherine turned toward the crowd and saw Margaret standing beside Lady Hawthorne, her cheeks flushed, her pale blue gown a delicate contrast to her golden curls. She looked lovely, gentle, uncertain. Catherine gave her a small nod of encouragement. As the night wore on, music filled the room with breathless crescendos, and couples waltzed in elegant circles beneath the chandeliers. Catherine declined several invitations to dance, waiting, expecting that Adrian would soon extend his hand. It was the rhythm they had always followed, a conversation, a pause, and then the dance. But as the final waltz approached, something shifted. Adrian's attention was drawn aside by a cluster of gentlemen. He excused himself. Catherine, holding her fan loosely between her fingers, turned to refresh her glass. The music paused. Then came the words she would remember long after the candles had burned to stubs. "Miss Margaret Elwood," said the Duke's unmistakable voice, clear and formal above the murmur, "would you honor me with the final dance?" The crystal dropped from Catherine's fingers before she knew it. It shattered quietly at her feet, muffled by the carpet. A footman rushed to sweep it away, but the damage had already been done. She turned slowly, the world narrowing to the space between her and her sister. Margaret had frozen in place, wide-eyed, lips parted in disbelief. The room, though still filled with music and movement, seemed to blur at the edges. Margaret's voice came small, hesitant. I would be honored, Your Grace." Adrian bowed, offered his hand, and Margaret took it. The waltz began. They moved to the center of the room, the Duke leading with the elegance of a man bred to it, Margaret following with a softness that made her seem to float. Around them, society watched with barely concealed fascination. Catherine remained still, her fingers curled around the empty stem of her lost glass. Her heart was not broken, not yet, but she felt a tightening in her chest, as though someone had drawn a corset string too tightly beneath her ribs. She did not cry, she did not speak, but the humiliation carved itself into her bones. A movement at her periphery drew her gaze. Near the far column, leaning in the shadow just beyond the lantern's glow, stood Lord Nathaniel Fairfax. He was not watching the dancers. He was watching her. His expression was unreadable, not mocking, not amused, angry. He did not speak, nor did he approach, but his presence struck her like a flame to dry parchment. She turned away. The dance ended with polite applause. Margaret curtsied, breathless and beaming, and Adrian escorted her to her mother. There was no announcement, no engagement, but the implication had been made. The room accepted it with nods, whispers, and careful smiles. Catherine walked to the open doors that led to the terrace. The cold night air wrapped around her like a second skin, biting, bracing, real. She rested her hands on the stone balustrade, staring out at the garden below, the frost glittering on the hedges like 1,000 tiny betrayals. Behind her, footsteps, slow, measured. "You held your composure well," came Nathaniel's voice, low and unflinching. "Better than most women would have after a performance like that." She did not turn. "What performance?" He stepped beside her. The waltz, the choice, the display. "Perhaps it was not a display," she said quietly. "Perhaps it was sincere." He looked at her, his eyes dark as storm clouds over moorland. "Then he's a fool." She exhaled, the breath trembling as it met the air. "Perhaps I am the greater one." Nathaniel leaned closer but did not touch her. "No, you are many things, Miss Elwood, but you are not a fool. You are a woman who terrifies weak men, and so they choose softness, something they believe they can control." She turned to face him at last. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears but with fury held in elegant restraint. "And what would you choose, my lord?" His voice dropped into something raw. "I would choose the fire, every time." And then he left her. No bow, no farewell, just his shadow trailing behind him like the ghost of a promise. Catherine remained on the terrace as the ball wound down, her hands cold, her heart colder still. Inside, Margaret laughed softly beside Adrian. And outside, under a frozen sky, Catherine made a vow that would never be spoken aloud. She would not shatter, she would burn. Bath awakened beneath a sheet of frost, its rooftops glittering beneath a pale sun that offered light but little warmth. The city wore its winter mask with quiet majesty, white lace upon stone, a stillness broken only by the muffled steps of servants, the distant rattle of wheels, and the occasional call of a blackbird perched upon wrought-iron gates. Catherine Elwood had not emerged from the house in 3 days. The drawing room, once a place of mild conversation and unspoken hopes, now sat in frozen silence. The fire had gone out twice that morning, and even the maid who tended it did so with hesitance, as if the room itself had asked to be left alone. A vase of winter roses had wilted untouched on the sideboard. The only sound was the ticking of the long case clock, marking time in heartbeats Catherine no longer cared to count. She sat in the window seat, not reading, not embroidering, simply staring into the bare-limbed garden, her gloved hands resting motionless on her lap. Her gown was simple today, a muted plum wool with no adornment, no brooch, no ribbon. The lace at her cuffs had not been pressed. Her hair, though still gathered neatly at the nape of her neck, had begun to loosen at the temples, soft tendrils falling along her cheek. The silence was not chosen, it had chosen her. Society had not come to call. There had been no invitations, no inquiries, no flowers, no notes, only the absence of everything that once gave her days their meaning. It was as though Bath had collectively agreed that Catherine Elwood, once admired and emulated, had become inconvenient, a shadow best left untouched. And shadows, after all, did not speak. From the stairwell came the soft tread of Margaret's footsteps. Catherine did not turn. She knew the rhythm of them well now, slow, hesitant, slightly uneven, as if guilt had settled in her ankles. Her sister entered quietly and hovered in the doorway, clutching a letter against her breast. "Catherine," she said, her voice barely more than breath, "you've not taken breakfast." "I am not hungry. I brought you tea." Catherine did not move. Margaret crossed the room, placing the tray gently upon the side table. The china rattled faintly, betraying the tremble in her hands. She turned to look at her sister, but Catherine's gaze remained on the garden. "I've written to Aunt Agnes," Margaret said softly. "She's asked us to visit in the spring." Still, no reply. "I think the air in Dover would do you good." Silence. Margaret stepped closer, her voice breaking. "Catherine, please." Finally, Catherine looked at her. The expression in her eyes was not cruel. It was not angry. It was worse. It was empty. Margaret blinked, a tear slipping free. She stepped back, placing the unopened letter on the writing desk before retreating from the room, her departure as soundless as her arrival. The door closed. Catherine turned back to the window. Outside, the garden was bathed in white, and yet Catherine saw only grey. It was not sorrow that gripped her. It was something colder, a kind of erasure. As if the woman she had been, radiant, hopeful, unshakable, had burned quietly to ash, while others applauded a dance. That afternoon she left the house without a word. She wrapped herself in her black velvet cloak, pulled her fur-lined gloves over her fingers, and stepped into the biting air like a ghost unwilling to haunt her own home. The streets of Bath, still bustling with holiday activity, paused at the sight of her, or rather, pretended not to see her. Shopkeepers who once greeted her now busied themselves arranging ribbons. A pair of matrons lowered their voices as she passed, whispering behind lace veils. Even the footmen standing outside the assembly rooms avoided her gaze. Gossip had spread through the city like frost over a window pane, thin, silent, and impossible to scrub away. They said she had been passed over, that the Duke had chosen innocence over fire, that Catherine Elwood's pride had made her blind to her own replacement. She walked the royal crescent without direction, the soles of her boots pressing softly into the salted pavement. The air was sharp, reddening her cheeks and nose. She welcomed it. At least the cold did not pretend. By the time she returned home, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The wind had begun to rise, and a snowflake or two drifted in the air like secrets not meant to be heard. A letter waited for her, not on the writing desk, not left by the post. It was tucked into the edge of the mirror in her room. The paper was thick, ivory, unsealed. Her name, simply Catherine, written in a hand she did not recognize at first. She unfolded it slowly. The message was brief. "You are not invisible to all," no signature, but she knew who had written it. The handwriting was strong, slanted, impatient. She had seen it once before, scrawled in the margins of a political pamphlet left on a table at Lady Meredith's salon, Nathaniel Fairfax. She read the sentence again. Not poetic, not romantic, not sentimental. And yet it landed deeper than all the flattery she had ever received. She folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer beneath her gloves. She did not smile, but she breathed. The next morning, she left the house again. This time, she did not keep to the shadows. She walked the crescent with her head held high. She nodded politely to those who looked away. She stopped to purchase oranges from the market stall, though she had no taste for them, and she walked past the assembly rooms without hesitation. Nathaniel was not there. She had not expected him to be. She returned home at midday, cheeks flushed with wind, her lungs aching from the cold. Margaret waited for her in the hallway. Catherine paused, unwinding her scarf. Margaret's eyes searched hers. "I never meant to." "I know," Catherine said calmly. "And yet you did." Margaret's lips trembled. "I don't know how to undo it." "You cannot." A silence stretched between them. "But you can learn to live with it," Catherine added, her voice softer. "As I will." Margaret's shoulders sagged in relief and despair. "Do you hate me?" "No," Catherine whispered, "but I mourn what we were." Then she walked past her and into the quiet of the house. That evening, Catherine wrote in her journal, not about Adrian, not about Margaret. She wrote about the day, the color of the sky, the taste of oranges, the cold that made her feel for once alive. And in the final line, she wrote one sentence in ink darker than any before: "I am not gone. I am not gone." The drawing room of the Elwood residence, once the stage of gentle laughter and poised conversation, now breathed with a different rhythm, measured, tense, uncertain. The portraits that lined the walls, ancestors with hollow eyes and gilded frames, seemed to watch more closely these days, as though even they sensed the delicate fracture threading through the house. It was the second week since the Christmas ball, and while winter remained unchanged, its frost etched into windows and its wind tugging at the edges of shawls, the balance within the family had shifted. Margaret was blooming. She received invitations nearly every morning now, each envelope trimmed with gold or sealed with a crest, some with subtle hints of introduction, others with overt intentions. She had been asked to sing at a musicale, to preside over a charity raffle, and to dine twice at the estate of Lady Whitcomb, who rarely acknowledged any woman under 30. The city, it seemed, had chosen her, and in doing so, it had forgotten Catherine. No longer was her name mentioned with reverence. No longer did matrons lower their voices in admiration of her intellect or elegance. Now they whispered with mouths barely concealed behind fans how swiftly the wind had turned, how prideful she must have been, how bitter. They speculated whether the Duke had ever truly intended to choose her. Some said he had only ever pitied her. Others claimed he had been ensnared by her ambition and that her failure had liberated him. Catherine heard none of it directly. She did not need to. Whispers in Bath moved like perfume, intangible, inescapable, and always close enough to sting. She spent her mornings walking the crescent, her posture straight, her gaze forward, dressed in the kind of quiet refinement that did not beg for notice, but demanded respect. Still, glances followed her, and always, from the edge of her vision, a judgment she refused to accept. It was during one such morning stroll that an invitation arrived, a simple cream card trimmed in forest green, inviting the Elwood ladies to tea at Lady Grafton's on Wednesday. Catherine had not expected to be included. She went. The salon was as warm and scented as ever, filled with the soft rustling of skirts, the clink of porcelain, and the carefully rehearsed laughter of women too clever to ever say exactly what they meant. Margaret sat near the hearth, surrounded by a circle of young ladies. Her smile was demure, her laugh precisely timed, and her gown, a soft ivory muslin with pale blue ribbon, was chosen with such care that Catherine recognized the hand behind it. It had been Catherine's idea, after all, to match the sash to Margaret's eyes. Catherine stood near the tea table, sipping slowly from her cup, feeling neither resentment nor pride, only distance. She was observing a play she had once been part of and now watched from the wings. "Miss Elwood." The voice came from behind her, low and sure. She turned. Lord Nathaniel Fairfax stood with his usual unstudied elegance. His frock coat was dark green velvet, his cravat slightly loosened. as though he had no interest in impressing anyone and, therefore, always did. His eyes, dark and amused, fixed on her with a boldness that did not pretend to be anything else. "Lord Fairfax?" she replied, dipping her head in cool greeting. "I was told you would not attend," he said, reaching for a biscuit from the table without asking. "I'm pleased the rumors were incorrect." "I have learned that most rumors are," she replied, taking another sip of tea. He tilted his head, studying her. "You carry yourself as if untouched. But you are not untouched, Miss Elwood. You are simply unreadable." "I consider that a virtue," she said, raising an eyebrow. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "It is, when wielded by someone who knows she's fire pretending to be ash." Her fingers tightened around the teacup. He did not smile. For a moment, neither of them moved. The room continued its performance around them. Laughter, music, soft conversations. While Catherine stood very still, his words coiling around her like smoke. She set her cup down with perfect control. "Careful, my lord. You speak as though you believe you know me." He held her gaze. "I do not. That is precisely why I return." He turned and walked away, leaving behind only the scent of bergamot and something wilder, unnameable. Catherine remained where she was, aware of the heat rising at the base of her neck. Not anger, not embarrassment, recognition. 2 days later, they met again, this time at Lady Everson's winter ball, an affair more subdued than the assembly, but no less strategic. The Elwood sisters arrived together. Margaret wore a rose-pink gown with gold trim, and her entrance was met with open admiration. Catherine chose navy silk, high-necked and fitted, adorned only by the onyx brooch left to her by her grandmother. Her hair was swept into a crown of braids. She did not enter for effect. She entered because she had been invited. The ballroom was warm, fragrant with pressed flowers and honeyed wine. The music was lighter tonight, less waltz, more country reel, and the guests younger, eager, buzzing. Catherine stood near the alcove observing. She had not yet danced. When Adrian Blackwood arrived, the atmosphere shifted. He was alone. His presence, as always, commanded space. His coat was midnight blue, his cravat stark white, his boots freshly polished. His eyes scanned the room, paused briefly on Margaret, then found Catherine. Their eyes met. He inclined his head slightly. She returned the gesture. Neither moved, but Nathaniel did. He approached Catherine with deliberate ease, a glass of wine in hand. "You're not dancing." "No." "Would you?" "Would I what?" "Dance with me." She looked at him, at the arch of his brow, the quiet challenge in his voice. "Would that not ruin your reputation?" He smirked. "That would require me to have one." Before she could reply, Adrian appeared beside them. "Miss Elwood," he said, addressing her and no one else. "Your Grace," she said calmly. Nathaniel stepped back half a pace, not out of deference, but out of something older, something primal. The silence between the two men was brief, but charged. "You look well," Adrian said to Catherine, his tone even. "As do you," she replied, her eyes steady. Nathaniel swirled the wine in his glass. "I was just convincing Miss Elwood to dance, though I see I may have competition." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I do not compete." "No," Nathaniel agreed, smiling. "You simply select." Catherine exhaled slowly. "I believe I shall sit this one out." Nathaniel nodded once, then stepped away. Adrian followed her gaze as she watched him disappear into the crowd. "You should not encourage him," Adrian said, his voice low. "Why?" she asked. "Does he make you uncomfortable?" He said nothing. She turned to him fully. "You made a choice, Your Grace. I suggest you learn to live with it." She walked away, leaving him alone in the alcove. That night, as the music continued and Margaret glided across the floor with yet another suitor, Catherine sat near the windows, watching the frost gather along the panes. She did not feel victorious, but she did feel real, and somewhere inside her, beneath the ashes of grace, something small and certain began to burn again. It was on a Wednesday morning. cold and blanched by a low-hanging sky, that the butler delivered the letter. The Elwood household had just settled into breakfast, and the clinking of silver against porcelain echoed faintly through the high-ceilinged dining room. Catherine sat at the far end of the table, her posture upright, her appetite absent, her hands wrapped around a teacup whose contents had long grown cold. Margaret sat across from her, rosy-cheeked and glowing with the unspoken satisfaction of a young woman adored. Their mother, Mrs. Elwood, perused the Bath Herald with deliberate grace. When the letter arrived, sealed with a dark green crest, Catherine knew before it was opened that it bore the Duke's name. Margaret's hands trembled as she took it. Her eyes widened with each line, her breath quickening. "He wishes to visit," she said softly, lowering the parchment. "He asks to call tomorrow, with permission." Mrs. Elwood smiled, but her smile was too measured. She folded the newspaper with great care, then looked to Catherine. "It seems things are progressing." Catherine set her cup down. "Margaret," their mother continued, "you must wear the cream lace with the sapphire pin, and Catherine," her voice gentled, but only slightly, "you will be kind. You will be supportive. For the sake of our name and your sister." The words were spoken with polished authority, but Catherine heard what lay beneath them. She was to be silent. She was to be gracious. She was to disappear elegantly, like the vapor of a snuffed-out candle. She nodded once. That afternoon passed in quiet preparations. Florists summoned, gloves pressed, arrangements rehearsed. Catherine remained in her chamber, seated before her mirror, brushing her hair with slow, mechanical strokes. The image that stared back was unchanged. High cheekbones, grey-green eyes, a face too still, but something behind her reflection had shifted. She no longer recognized the woman who waited patiently for affection. She did not mourn her, but she did not yet know who had taken her place. The next day, at precisely 3, Adrian Blackwood entered their home. He wore a dark coat lined with silk, his boots freshly shined, and a bouquet of white hyacinths in hand. His voice, when he greeted Margaret, was gentle and sincere. Catherine watched from across the drawing room, every word he spoke thudding softly against her ribs like distant echoes. Mrs. Elwood kept her smiles small and her corrections subtle. Margaret blushed often. Catherine remained silent, neither withdrawn nor confrontational, her stillness a kind of protest. After tea was served and pleasantries exchanged, the room thinned with unspoken orchestration. Margaret was called away by their mother, something about ribbons or a guest list, and Catherine was left alone with him. Adrian looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the weight of his gaze was heavier than she remembered. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the chair beside her. She nodded once. He sat, folding his hands between his knees. "I owe you honesty," he said after a pause. "Perhaps too late, but honesty nonetheless." Catherine said nothing. Her eyes remained fixed on the fire. "I considered you," he began, "very seriously. You are a woman of intellect, of elegance, and he hesitated. "I admired you. Still do." Her breath caught, but she willed her face to remain impassive. "But," she whispered. He exhaled, as if the word itself weighed more than he cared to admit. "But I was not certain I could offer you the kind of affection you deserve. You do not make it easy to forget one's own shortcomings. You see too much, and You chose someone simpler," she finished for him. He flinched. "I chose someone gentle," he said softly, "someone who brings peace." She turned to face him fully. "And you believed I would bring war." Their eyes locked. Silence stretched between them like a taut string. "You were never meant to be anyone's peace," he said at last. "You were meant to burn, and I feared I would not survive the fire." Catherine stood then slowly, and he rose with her. "I hope she brings you all the quiet you crave," she said, her voice even. "But do not come to me bearing confessions once you've made your choice. I'm not a confessional," he inclined his head, "nor are you a woman to be pitied." She met his gaze one final time, then turned and left the room. Outside, dusk had begun to fall. The gardens were glazed with frost, each blade of grass encased in crystal. Catherine walked beyond the stone steps, beyond the trimmed hedges, until she reached the edge of the orchard, where the trees stood bare and unapologetic. There, among the dormant branches and curling mist, she found him, Nathaniel Fairfax. He stood near the sundial, gloved hands clasped behind his back, his coat collar turned against the wind. He did not look surprised to see her. "I heard the Duke was calling today," he said quietly. "You hear everything," she replied. He turned to face her fully. "Not everything, only what matters." She stood still, the cold brushing her cheeks, her fingers curled within her cloak. "He said I made him feel small," she murmured, her voice raw. "That I made him see himself too clearly." Nathaniel's gaze darkened. "And yet, he was the one who made you feel unseen." She looked down. "I let him." "No," he said, stepping closer. "You believed in him. That is not the same thing." She did not answer. The silence between them was different than any she had known, charged, breathing, waiting. "You were never meant to be part of someone else's comfort," he said, his voice roughened by the wind. "You are not the sigh that follows peace. You are the gasp that comes before transformation." Her heart stuttered, and then he reached out, not with force, not with assumption. His hand brushed against her sleeve, a mere graze, yet it burned like a brand. Their eyes met, neither moved, neither dared. Then his hand slid down, fingers brushing hers, slow, deliberate. His thumb grazed the inside of her wrist. Her breath caught. He leaned forward close enough that she felt his breath against her temple. "If I kiss you now," he murmured, "there will be no pretending it meant nothing." She stood still, eyes closing. But the kiss never came. He stepped back, and the space between them surged with everything that could have been. Catherine opened her eyes. Nathaniel's expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "When you are ready," he said, "I will not come as a shadow. I will come as a man who sees you." And then he turned and walked back through the garden path, his figure slowly swallowed by the fading light. Catherine remained alone, her pulse echoing in her ears, her breath visible in the cold. The wind whispered through the trees. She placed a hand against her chest, not to still her heart, but to acknowledge it was still hers. The frost returned with vengeance that week, as if winter itself had heard the murmurs of Bath and sought to crystallize them into silence. White crept over every window pane like judgment, and the streets echoed with the brittle sound of boots striking frozen stone. In the salons, whispers flowed more freely than tea, and every glance carried the weight of speculation. Catherine Elwood had become a subject of fascination once more, but for reasons the matrons of Bath did not deem proper. The invitation arrived hand-delivered by a gloved footman whose coat bore no crest. It was not scented. It was not folded with flirtation. It was simply penned plainly in a confident hand that did not request, but informed. "There will be an exhibit at the Worthington Gallery. Noon. I will be there. Whether alone or not, I leave to you." No signature. She did not need one. That morning, Catherine dressed in deliberate silence. She chose a gown of slate-blue wool, high-necked and belted with black velvet. Her cloak was lined with sable, her gloves soft suede. There was no brooch, no lace, no jewelry, except the mourning ring she never removed from her right hand. Margaret stood in the doorway as she pinned her hair. "You're truly going with him?" she asked, her voice lined with both disbelief and dread. Catherine met her sister's gaze in the mirror. "I am." Margaret stepped forward. "You know what they'll say." "They've said worse," Catherine replied calmly. "He's dangerous, Catherine. He's unpredictable. He's honest," Catherine interrupted, "and I would rather face scandal in honesty than safety in hypocrisy." Margaret looked stricken. "What will Mama say?" "What she always says." Catherine tied the ribbons of her bonnet. "Nothing to my face, and everything to the neighbors." She passed her sister without another word and stepped into the cold. The Worthington Gallery was small but elegant, nestled between a milliner's and an apothecary. Its windows, usually veiled in muslin, had been thrown open that morning to reveal a series of landscapes from the continent. Some brooding, some luminous, all painted by artists who dared to capture the chaos of emotion rather than its polite arrangements. Nathaniel was already there. He stood near the center, hands clasped behind his back, studying a storm-tossed seascape. When he turned, the room shifted, or perhaps it was only Catherine who felt it. "You came," he said, without surprise. "I was curious," she answered, removing her gloves. "About the art?" he asked, eyes flicking to her lips. "About your intentions?" He stepped closer. "I have only ever had one intention, which is to wake you up." The words struck her not like thunder, but like the hush that follows it, deafening in its clarity. They walked through the gallery side by side, never touching, never rushing. Catherine felt the heat of his presence beside her like a sun behind a veil. They spoke sparingly, of composition, of brushwork, of color, but each glance, each pause between words, felt like a page turning in a book only they could read. A lady passing by gasped softly upon seeing them and whispered behind a gloved hand to her companion. Catherine did not look away. She had grown tired of shrinking. By the time they reached the final painting, an untitled portrait of a woman veiled in crimson silk, Catherine felt the silence between them thrum like a violin string drawn too tight. "She reminds me of you," Nathaniel said. Catherine tilted her head. "Why?" "Because she's not hiding. She's choosing what to reveal." She turned to him slowly. "You speak as though you see me clearly." "I do." A pause. "No one else does," she said, the truth leaving her like breath on glass. "I know," he whispered. It was almost enough. That evening, Lady Ambrose's soiree glimmered with candlelight and sharp tongues. Catherine attended, draped in elegance and defiance. The ballroom gleamed. The guests whispered more than danced. She knew what they were saying. He escorted her alone. They strolled without chaperone. She lingered beside him for more than an hour. And did you hear? He did not speak to a single other woman that night. But Catherine walked through the crowd with her chin held high, no longer fearing the weight of her own presence. Nathaniel arrived late. When he entered, there was no fanfare, no announcement, only the hush of those who saw and could not look away. He approached her directly. "Shall we scandalize them further?" he asked, offering his arm. "I believe they expect it now," she replied, resting her hand upon his sleeve. They did not dance. They walked, slowly, deliberately, around the perimeter of the ballroom, speaking in low tones, pausing at the windows, exchanging not pleasantries, but truths. At one point, he stopped beneath the colonnade, where the light from the chandeliers spilled in long golden lines. She turned to him. "What do you want from me?" she asked, voice hushed. He stepped closer. "Everything you won't give to anyone else." Her breath caught. "I don't belong to anyone," she said. "I don't want you to," he replied. "I want you to belong to yourself. And then, if you choose, stand beside me." She looked up at him, the air between them charged, trembling. "I don't trust easily," she whispered. "I don't lie easily," he answered. His hand rose slowly, reverently, and cupped her cheek. The touch was light, reverent, but it held her like an oath. He leaned forward, and she let him. Their lips met, not with hunger but with gravity, as though something inevitable had finally settled into place. The kiss was soft, aching and brief, but when it ended, nothing was the same. Catherine stepped back, breathing shallow. Nathaniel looked at her as if he'd just touched fire and wanted nothing more than to be burned again. Before she could speak, movement behind them caught her attention. It was Lady Hartwell, eyes wide, mouth parted, frozen mid-step. Catherine held her gaze. Then she turned back to Nathaniel and said, loud enough to be heard by all who would soon ask, "Good evening, my lord." And she walked away, leaving whispers in her wake. At home, hours later, Margaret waited for her in the drawing room, still in her evening dress. "You kissed him," she said. Catherine removed her gloves slowly. "Yes. You must stop, before you destroy what's left of our name." Catherine turned to her sister, her eyes glinting like tempered steel. "Our name was never mine to destroy. It was never mine to claim." Margaret's voice trembled. "Adrian plans to propose to me, publicly, on Christmas Eve." Catherine said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Congratulations." The words fell like snow. Soft, cold, final. That night, as Catherine undressed in the quiet of her chamber, she placed her hand over her lips. They still tingled. Not from the kiss, but from the truth of it. Snow had fallen steadily since dawn, blanketing Bath in a hush so complete it seemed the city itself had paused to listen. The rooftops glistened like sugared confections, the streets were quiet, but for the muffled rhythm of carriage wheels, and the air carried that particular stillness, reserved only for Christmas Eve, a stillness heavy with memory, anticipation, and the ache of things unsaid. The Elwood residence was alight with preparation. Fires had been lit in every hearth, holly garlands adorned the banisters, and the scent of cinnamon, wax, and pine wove through the rooms like an invisible ribbon. In the upstairs chamber, Catherine stood before her mirror, fastening the final hook of her gown. It was deep green silk, heavy and lustrous, its folds catching the candlelight like shadows moving through emerald. Her hair had been styled into a crown of braids, interlaced with jet combs. Around her neck she wore no jewels, only the thinnest chain of silver, barely visible. There was no adornment, no perfume. She had chosen elegance over embellishment, restraint over spectacle. The mirror gave nothing away, and yet Catherine could feel the battle within her, composure clashing with the quiet chaos she carried just beneath the surface. There was a knock at the door. Margaret entered without waiting for a reply. Her gown was soft rose-pink embroidered with silver thread and adorned with small satin bows at the shoulders. Her hair had been curled into delicate ringlets, and her cheeks bore the flush of excitement or fear. It was hard to tell which. "You look beautiful," she said. "As do you." Margaret hesitated. "You're really coming. Did you believe I wouldn't?" Margaret twisted her hands together. "Mama said it would be easier if you stayed home." Catherine turned toward her. "Easier for whom?" Margaret's lips parted, but no answer came. Catherine crossed the room and took her sister's hands. "I won't make a scene," she said gently. "You need not worry. I know my place." Margaret flinched. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" A silence bloomed between them. Then quietly Margaret said, "I don't know how we became this." Catherine gave a small, tired smile. "We didn't become this, Margaret. It was always there. We were simply too young, too kind, or too blind to see it." Downstairs, the sound of a carriage arriving broke through the stillness. It had begun. Lady Fairchild's annual Christmas Eve gathering was the most extravagant affair in Bath, a glittering constellation of the city's finest. The drawing rooms were draped in crimson velvet and gold tassels, every candle polished and burning bright. Crystal punch bowls sparkled on mirrored trays. Musicians played in the corner, their notes weaving through the perfume and chatter with practiced grace. Catherine entered alone. She moved through the crowd like a ship slicing through ice, graceful, unhurried, unflinching. All eyes turned, some in admiration, most in surprise. The green silk of her gown shimmered beneath the chandeliers. She nodded politely to those who stared. She spoke to no one unless spoken to. And then he appeared, Nathaniel. He stood across the room, half-shadowed near a marble column, watching her. His coat was midnight black, his cravat a muted wine. There was nothing festive in his attire, and yet he belonged to the room more fully than anyone else. Their eyes met. He did not smile, he did not move. He waited. Catherine made her way to him, slowly. When she reached him, she lifted her chin and said softly, "You're late." "I'm exactly where I should be," he replied. They stood in silence for a moment, neither breaking the gaze, the music swelling around them like a wave they refused to ride. Then, without asking, he offered his hand, and Catherine, without fear, took it. The waltz began. They stepped onto the floor. The room silenced itself. Guests parted, shocked. The green silk and the black wool turned together in rhythm, circling, gliding, each movement a rebellion, each step a declaration. Catherine did not look at anyone, only at him, and he only at her. When the music faded, applause rose, hesitant, forced, like thunder on a dry sky. Catherine curtsied. Nathaniel bowed. They stepped apart. The air between them remained charged. Then Adrian entered. He was flanked by Lady Whitcomb and Margaret. There was no mistaking his intention. His gait was calm but certain, his expression composed. Margaret looked down as they walked, her fingers barely brushing the Duke's sleeve. Gasps broke across the room as Adrian paused near the fireplace, beside the grand piano draped in white roses and ivy. He turned toward Margaret and dropped to one knee. Catherine froze. The crowd closed in. The words were not heard by all, but the gesture was unmistakable. A velvet box, a golden ring, a murmur of her name. Margaret blinked. Her hand flew to her mouth. She nodded. Applause erupted. Catherine stepped back. The noise was too much, the lights too bright. The fragrance of roses cloying. She moved toward the hallway, her heels silent on the marble. Outside the drawing room, in the shadow of a staircase, she stopped. She could still hear the music. She closed her eyes. "Why did you do it?" Margaret's voice pierced the stillness behind her. Catherine turned. Margaret stood there, breathless, alone. "Why did you let them see you with him? Why did you dance, knowing it would ruin everything?" Catherine's gaze sharpened. "Ruin what?" "The moment," Margaret hissed. "It was supposed to be perfect. You said yes, but they were all watching you." Catherine tilted her head. "And that makes you less engaged." Margaret looked away, then back. "You stole the attention." "I didn't steal it," Catherine said quietly. "They gave it. I didn't ask for it. You ruined my moment." "No, Margaret," Catherine said, stepping closer. "I did nothing that wasn't already breaking." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You hate me." "No," Catherine said, her voice calm, almost sorrowful. "But I don't protect you anymore, not from the world, not from yourself." A long silence stretched between them. Then Catherine stepped past her, back into the golden light. She did not cry until she reached her room, and even then, only for a moment. Tears slid down her cheeks without sound, falling onto the silk of her gown like rain on marble. But when she looked in the mirror, red-eyed, regal, real, she did not see a woman defeated. She saw a woman reborn. The morning after the Christmas Eve ball arrived, cloaked in silence. Snow had not fallen overnight, but the wind carried with it the hush of something ending. A veil of grey clouds stretched across the sky, softening the light that spilled through the frost-covered windows of the Elwood townhouse. Margaret sat alone in the small blue parlour where the sisters once took tea and whispered about dreams. Her hands trembled in her lap, twisting a lace handkerchief until its edges frayed. The fire crackled low behind her, but it offered no warmth. Not to her, not now. She had been awake since before dawn, the echo of her sister's words still ringing in her ears. I did nothing that wasn't already breaking. Something in those words had snapped a chord inside her chest, not with violence but with truth. Quiet, searing truth. All night, Margaret had felt that break echo through her bones. She had accepted Adrian's proposal, but even as the ring had slid onto her finger, her soul had pulled away from it. And now she waited. When the knock came at the drawing-room door, her heart surged into her throat. "Come in," she whispered. The door opened slowly and Adrian stepped in. He looked as impeccable as ever, though his cravat was slightly looser than usual. His eyes, always calm, betrayed a heaviness this morning that Margaret had never seen before. "You asked to see me," he said gently. "Yes." He crossed the room but did not sit. He stood before her, hands clasped behind his back, as if he were bracing for a duel. Neither of them had the strength to fight. Margaret rose. Her voice quivered as she spoke. "Do you remember the moment when you danced with Catherine at the assembly?" His brow furrowed. "Of course. You watched her," she continued, her words barely more than air. "Not as a friend, not as a brother-in-law-to-be. You watched her as if," she faltered, "as if you were mourning something you never had the courage to keep." Adrian remained silent. Margaret swallowed hard, the tears rising. "You never looked at me like that." He did not deny it. She stepped back. "And still you proposed." "I believed it was the right thing," he said softly. "For your family, for mine, for appearances. I thought affection would grow, that we might build something kind and steady." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on a crack in the floorboard. "But you never saw me." A pause. "No," he said, "not in the way you deserved." Tears slid down her cheeks then, not of heartbreak, but of clarity. "I do not blame you," she whispered. "We were both trying to build a life out of borrowed pieces." Adrian exhaled and stepped closer. He reached for her hand and pressed it gently in his. "You are a good woman, Margaret. Far better than I ever deserved. But I will not tether you to a life of quiet absence." She nodded, unable to speak. Her fingers slipped from his, and with that the engagement dissolved, like frost beneath the first touch of sun. Later that afternoon, Catherine found a letter waiting on her writing desk. The seal was unbroken, the handwriting unmistakable. She opened it with cautious fingers. "Dearest Catherine, I'm leaving Bath tomorrow. I need time. I need space from the weight of everyone's expectations, yours, mother's, society's, my own. Adrian and I are no longer engaged. It ended without tears or anger. Only the quiet understanding of two people who tried to rewrite a story already etched in another language. I do not blame you, I never did, but I have spent too long trying to live in your shadow, and I believe I must now discover who I am without it. When I return, if I return, I hope we might speak not as rivals or reflections, but as sisters again." With affection, Margaret Catherine read the letter twice. Then she sat very still, the page resting in her lap like an artifact from another life. That evening she did not dine with her mother. She wrapped herself in a charcoal wool shawl and stepped out alone into the snow-covered garden where the bare trees reached like bones toward the sky. There she found him, Nathaniel. He stood by the iron gate, his coat collar turned high, his expression unreadable. "You came," she said. "You wrote," he replied. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet-wrapped box. Her breath caught, but when he opened it, there was no ring inside. Instead, nestled in satin was a key. "To what?" she asked. "To the cottage near Somerset," he said. "It isn't grand. It has no title, no name carved above its lintel. But it has a garden and a fireplace, and a view of the hills in spring. It is a place where no one will ask you to smile when you're breaking, or dance when you'd rather be still." She looked up at him, heart thrumming. "I'm not offering you a title, Catherine. I'm not offering you salvation, only the chance to be yourself, entirely, with no disguise, no expectation, no script written by someone else." She reached out and took the key. "Then I suppose I must decide whether to use it," she murmured. Nathaniel held her gaze. "Whatever you choose, I will not love you less." Her lips trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of something she had long denied herself. Tenderness without condition, love without performance. She looked toward the house, its windows glowing gold in the dusk. Inside, her mother would be sitting by the fire, counting the guests who had not yet called, measuring Catherine's worth by silence and missed invitations. Catherine turned back to Nathaniel. "I won't rebuild it," she whispered. "Not the life they wanted. Not the mask, not the brittle future." He stepped closer, and their foreheads nearly touched. "No," she breathed. "I want something new, something true." He said nothing. He only reached for her hand. And in the quiet of falling snow, she let him take it, not as a duke, not as a rebellion, but as a man, and as a woman who had finally chosen for herself. The countryside of Somerset was still kissed by winter. Though spring stirred faintly beneath the earth, the trees remained bare, and the hills held the silence of frost. At the edge of the village stood a modest estate, neither grand nor forgotten, a place between worlds. It was there that the scandal began. And it was there, too, that something truer than scandal ever dared to name was born. The estate, formerly a hunting lodge belonging to the Fairfax family, had been transformed. The heavy velvet drapes had been replaced with linen. The chandeliers gleamed with fresh polish, and the ballroom, though small by London standards, now pulsed with candlelight and anticipation. It was the night of Catherine Elwood's first ball, or rather, Mrs. Elwood Fairfax, a title that society whispered in confusion, for there had been no formal announcement, no banns read aloud in the churches of Bath or London, no carriages lined the streets with embroidered invitations in hand. Only a modest gathering of kind souls and curious neighbours had been welcomed into the warm light of the estate's great hall, and still the world watched. From the shadows beyond the hedgerows, from letters exchanged over breakfast parlours, from footmen whispering in corridors, they watched. Among them, Adrian Blackwood stood alone at the crest of a hill overlooking the house. His greatcoat billowed in the cold wind, his boots planted in the frost-hardened soil. In his gloved hand, he held a letter, creased once, then twice, worn at the corners where he had opened it too many times. He read it again by memory. "Adrian, you once asked me if I would have said yes had you asked me first. I didn't answer then, because the truth would have embarrassed us both. No, you were never meant to choose me, not truly, and I was never meant to be chosen as an afterthought. You are not unkind, only cautious, but I needed a love reckless enough to burn for me, and I have found it. We are not enemies, only ghosts of what society tried to write before we learned to hold the pen. Be well. Catherine." He folded it slowly and tucked it into his coat. There would be no dramatic declarations, no last-minute appeals. The chapter had closed with dignity, and that perhaps was the most Catherine thing she had ever given him. He turned and disappeared into the wind. Inside the estate, music began, gentle, refined, a string quartet playing a country waltz that warmed the floorboards. Laughter echoed off the modest stone walls, and at the top of the staircase, Catherine stood. She wore no diamonds, no tiara. Her gown was moss-green silk with a square neckline edged in antique lace. Her dark hair was swept into a low chignon, held by a single silver comb. Her only jewelry was a locket, simple, oval, and beloved. Beside her, Nathaniel waited, handsome, in a dark velvet coat and cravat the color of wine. He did not offer his arm as a duke might, but extended his hand as an equal. Catherine took it. Their entrance was not grand, but it turned every head. Some gasped, some curtsied, and some, bless them, smiled, not because they understood, but because they knew how rare it was for someone to walk into their own life without apology. Later that evening, as the rooms filled with conversation and the scent of orange blossom and pine, a carriage arrived beneath the moonlight. From it stepped Margaret Elwood. She no longer wore pale pastels or timid florals. Instead, she descended in a deep plum walking dress with black velvet trim and gloves to match. Her bonnet was trimmed with dark ribbon, and her eyes held no trace of hesitation. She did not ask to be announced. She simply stepped inside, removed her gloves with care, and crossed the threshold of the life she had once tried to borrow. She found Catherine in the small antechamber off the ballroom, arranging flowers in a vase. The sisters' eyes met, no orchestra to frame the moment, only the quiet of an open door. Catherine straightened. Her heart pounded, but she said nothing. Margaret closed the door behind her and stood still. "I received your letter," she said. Catherine nodded. "I read it beside a stream," Margaret continued, her voice trembling. There were daffodils, though it's still winter. Silence. I came because I no longer want to live as someone else's idea of me, Margaret whispered. And because I miss you. Catherine exhaled slowly, tears rising. Do you know what I miss? She asked. Your humming at night. You used to hum when you thought no one could hear. Margaret's eyes shimmered. I still do. They stepped forward, arms meeting halfway, as if the very ache between them had learned to guide them. They embraced, not tightly, but wholly, not as children, but as women who had loved, failed, and lived. I was never angry at you, Margaret murmured against her shoulder. I was never trying to win, Catherine replied. Their tears were soft, not bitter, not regretful, only true. When they emerged from the room, their hands were linked. No scandal, no shame, only the quiet strength of forgiveness. The ball carried on into the evening. Guests dined on roasted game and pears in wine. They danced to familiar melodies. Children peeked from behind banisters, and elders exchanged approving glances. Near midnight, as snow began to fall again, slow, swirling, delicate, Catherine and Nathaniel stepped out onto the back terrace. The world was white and hushed. They walked to the edge of the garden, where the hedges curved and opened to a path beyond. The snowfall kissed their shoulders and hair, silent benedictions from a sky that no longer judged. Nathaniel held her hand, their fingers entwined not out of propriety, but out of certainty. Do you regret the scandal? He asked softly. She smiled, watching the flakes melt against his coat. Not if it gave me a name that feels like mine. And what name is that? Catherine, she said. Only Catherine. He brought her hand to his lips, and in the stillness of the garden, where no music played and no eyes watched, they stood as they were. No duchess, no fallen debutante, no titled libertine, just two hearts that had chosen each other over everything else. Behind them, through the golden-lit windows, laughter rang, and in the kitchen, the staff danced quietly among themselves, taking turns humming the melody of the final waltz. And beyond that, in the world that had once caged them both, rumors would be whispered, speculations written, stories twisted. But none of it mattered, because in a modest country house beneath the last snowfall of the season, a scandal had bloomed. One not of disgrace, but of love finally dared and fully lived. Somerset, January of 1855. Snow blanketed the garden once more, soft and familiar, like the pages of a well-worn book turning themselves in time. The estate, still modest, still unpretentious, stood strong beneath the pale winter sky, its windows glowing with life. Inside, laughter echoed through the drawing room, where a fire roared and the scent of pine mingled with that of lemon cakes cooling on the sideboard. A child's delighted squeal broke through the warmth, followed by the sound of tiny feet racing across the wooden floor. "Julia," Catherine called gently, stepping into the room with a shawl in her arms. "Come now, your father is waiting." The little girl turned with wide, curious eyes, chestnut curls bouncing beneath a knitted bonnet too large for her small head. She was 2 years old and already asking questions beyond her years, already walking with the same determined grace her mother once wielded in ballroom slippers. From the study, Nathaniel emerged. Time had softened him in the ways that mattered and sharpened him in the ways Catherine adored. He still wore his coat with irreverent elegance and kissed his wife's wrist before her cheek, but the wildness in him had gentled, not vanished, only evolved. "Will she wear the boots or revolt again?" he asked, raising a brow as he scooped Julia into his arms. "She has chosen revolt," Catherine replied with a mock sigh. "She gets that from you." Nathaniel grinned. "Nonsense. I never revolted. I simply redirected the narrative." "Whoa!" They laughed quietly, in the way couples do when the world outside no longer has the power to wound them. Their home had become a sanctuary, not from society, but from the hollow expectations they had once obeyed. Here, they had built a life not defined by titles, but by tenderness. They hosted gatherings with musicians and poets, they fostered wounded animals, and Nathaniel, ever the provocateur, had taken to writing essays under a pseudonym defending the dignity of women who had chosen love over status. Catherine, for her part, had begun teaching reading to girls in the village. She no longer dressed for approval, but for freedom, often wearing practical skirts and wide-brimmed hats that made the old women frown and the young ones dream. They were not rich. They were not grand, but they were known, and they were respected, not because they played the game, but because they had walked away from the table and dared to build their own. Far from Somerset, in a quieter corner of Devon, Margaret Elwood sat beneath a blooming magnolia tree, writing a book by hand. She had returned from the countryside with a spine forged in solitude. She had never married, not out of bitterness, but because she had discovered how much of herself had once been shaped by trying to be chosen. Now she chose daily to write, to study botany, to host small gatherings of women who longed to speak without judgment. Her garden was a thing of legend, and her peace hard-earned. Every spring, a letter arrived from Catherine, and every autumn, one returned from Margaret. Their reconciliation had not been instant, nor effortless, but it had been true. Forgiveness, they had discovered, was not a single moment. It was a decision made again and again in quiet ways. And Adrian, the Duke of Carleton, had never remarried. He spent his days managing estates and offering discreet patronage to charities supporting orphan boys. His household remained stately and immaculate, yet deeply silent. On occasion he visited Bath, but never during the season. Some said he had grown colder, others said kinder. No one knew for certain. But a year after the infamous Somerset ball, he was seen walking alone in the hills, carrying a book of poetry under his arm and a pressed flower folded between the pages. He had loved two sisters in different ways and lost them both. Society changed, slowly, as it always does. The scandal of Catherine Elwood's departure from Bath had long faded, replaced by newer gossip. A viscount had married his chambermaid. A marquis had run off with a pianist from Vienna. The world continued spinning. But in quieter circles, Catherine became a legend, not as a duchess nor a fallen lady, but as a woman who had said no and survived. In the final pages of her private diary, never published, never shared, Catherine once wrote, "Love is not found where one is most admired, but where one is most seen. And in the eyes of a man the world once called a scandal, I found my home." On the 3rd anniversary of their first ball, snow fell once more on Somerset. Catherine and Nathaniel walked side by side beneath the same arbor where they had once stood hand in hand. Their daughter toddled ahead, trying to catch snowflakes on her tongue, and behind them, the house glowed with life. Books stacked in corners, portraits hung without vanity, candles flickering against stormy glass. A home built on ruin and laughter, a love carved not in marble, but in endurance. And for the first time in years, Catherine closed her eyes and thought, yes, this is how a scandal ends, in joy, in peace, in love that asks nothing but the truth, if you stayed until the end. You already know this wasn't just a story about stolen dances, broken engagements, or scandalous whispers echoing through candlelit halls. This was a story about choosing yourself, about walking away from what's expected and walking toward what sets your soul alight. Catherine didn't find happiness in a title. She found it in the mirror when she could finally look at her reflection and say, "This is who I am, and it is enough." Nathaniel didn't offer her a castle. He offered her something far more daring, the freedom to be loved as she was, not as the world wished her to be. Margaret, too, reminds us that redemption isn't always about romance. Sometimes it's about forgiving ourselves, about starting over, about blooming in places no one thought to look. And Adrian, Even the hearts left behind in our stories teach us something, that kindness and regret can live in the same silence, and that love not chosen is still love that shaped us. So if you, dear listener, have ever felt unseen, if you've ever questioned whether your voice matters, let this tale be your gentle reminder. You are not too much, you are not too late, and your story is not over. If this journey moved you, tell us in the comments. Write the word reborn so we know you made it all the way to the end. It helps us keep telling stories for hearts like yours. And if you'd like to support the team behind this channel, those who write, narrate, and bring these worlds to life, consider leaving a super thanks in any amount you feel called to. Your kindness makes it possible for more stories like this to reach those who need them. But if that's not possible right now, you can still make a difference by sharing this video with someone who loves romance, resilience, and second chances. And don't forget to explore the other historical dramas we've prepared for you. Just click the cards at the end of this video. Who knows? Your next favorite story may be only a heartbeat away. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling. Until the next love story, stay true, stay brave, and stay beautifully you.